Thank you to everyone for joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Anna Stokes, Marketing Director here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. On behalf of the entire CCI team, we appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we are joined by Kelly Burton and Leshawnda Larkin to discuss how you can activate your DEI goals for company good. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world working to change the practice and perception of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our Senior Leader Network membership. Several times a month, we are offering these virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Kelly and Leshawnda will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of our session. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during our time together. If you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Today, we are joined by Kelly Burton, the Executive Director of the Black Innovation Alliance and the founder of Nexus Research Group, a social impact firm that works with foundations and large-scale nonprofits to help them catalyze change in local communities. She is also the founder. She is also behind Founders of Color, a digital platform committed to helping minority entrepreneurs grow and scale their businesses. We are also joined by Leshawnda Larkin, the head of brand marketing at Dolby Laboratories, where she is responsible for driving awareness for Dolby experiences in premium entertainment across TV, movies, music, and gaming. A seasoned marketing executive, Leshawnda has held marketing positions at Samsung, PepsiCo Frito-Lay, Dr. Pepper, Snapple, Cadbury Schweppes, and Johnson & Johnson. Leshawnda recently joined the board of directors for the Black Innovation Alliance. We are so excited to welcome Kelly and Leshawnda and look forward to hearing from both of you about how to activate DEI in our companies to support our conscious business practices. Kelly and Leshawnda, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Anna. Appreciate that. Hey, Leshawnda.
Hello, hello.
It's so good to be here with you. Thanks so much for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone that's watching today. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about DEI.
So I think we agreed that we would, instead of it being an interview style, that we just have a conversation and allow the energy to flow back and forward. That's always my personal preference. So I thought it would be good for us to have a dialogue today. And I'm looking forward to hearing the questions that folks have on the back end of our discussion as well.
Awesome. So I'll ask the first question of you to get this conversation started.
Let's do it.
So part of Conscious Capitalism mission is to elevate humanity through business. Mm-hmm. How do conscious leaders make the connection between this philosophy and the push for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion?
That's a good one. And for me, it's so funny as a woman of color. It's so clear, but then I'm like, well, maybe it's not as clear. Let me think about that. I was actually watching Inherit the Wind earlier this week. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's an old movie with Spencer Tracy and Gene Kelly about the Scopes monkey trial, which was all about evolution. And it was probably, I don't know, in the 20s or 30s. And I was so like, I don't want to say shocked, but I was really, I realized how closed-minded and small-minded small towns were during that time in terms of just the lack of openness to new ideas, to outsiders. And I realized that a lot of the stereotypes that we have about others are forged in times where we had lower levels of consciousness. And that's what I love about conscious capitalism and this notion of achieving some sort of elevated humanity. It's like we've come a long way in our knowledge and understanding. We know we have the science now to reinforce that the stereotypes that we have about people of color and about, women versus men, that those stereotypes are not grounded in any real science. And so now we get to do the work of writing those disparities. And the last thing that I'll say is I'm very aware as a Black woman about just all of the ways that American capitalism has been extractive from the beginning in terms of extracting from Black labor, extracting from native lands and obtaining native lands by hook or by crook, with this notion being that the goal is to maximize profits by all means necessary, without necessarily taking into account the moral implications of the choices and decisions that are made. And so, that's why I'm hopeful around this conscious capitalism movement to say, can we move forward in ways that are conscious, that are ethical, that do not lean into extraction, but seek to find opportunities and ways to incorporate all people into this emerging economy. So I'm curious, how do you view it? I imagine that you consider yourself as a conscious leader. So, but also a Black woman in leadership. What do you see as the connection?
Wow, that's a very deep question, because I try to be a conscious leader. I hope that I'm a conscious leader. You have to be very brave to work in that space.
Yes.
I'm really focused on inspiring my team, bringing out the best around them and building community, speaking with integrity, and being authentic. And I think also being a Black woman in leadership, I want to bring my full self and being authentic to who I am.
Yes.
And there's a strength and perseverance that's there as well, that I see common between being a Black woman in leadership, but also being a conscious leader. There are times where it could easily be swayed to kind of go in a different route. And that's where that strength and perseverance is needed to kind of remain being conscious. So
I love that.
So I come to this conversation, as a corporate executive and internal advocate for DEI, and you come to this conversation, as a consultant, where you've helped businesses activate against their goals. What do you see as some of the major impediments to companies making progress today?
Yeah. So I think the biggest challenge that we have in this country is just a lack of knowledge and understanding about the implications of race and gender in our society and in the workplace. I would imagine when you ask your typical person, like, what is race, or where did it come from, or why do people call you Black, and why do people call you white? We don't even really have an understanding of where the concept comes from. Race as a concept, as a construct, is only 400 or 500 years old. It wasn't an idea until the establishment of the New World. And so race as an idea was created to filter opportunities and resources. The first time that you see it in Virginia legislation in the 1500s, it's about providing additional benefit to indentured European servants, specifically providing them gun ownership and essentially the right to lord over the indentured African servants and the native people. And so to this day, race still works in that way to filter and direct opportunities and resources. That's what it was designed to do. And even today, race is the dominant predictor of life outcomes across the board. Because again, that's what it was designed to do. We tend to think in this country that race is a feature of our society, when in actuality, race is functional, and it's intended to function and accommodate a particular purpose. So I think we just need to really focus on racial literacy and help folks to understand kind of how we got here and what we need to process forward. And the only other two things that I will mention, it's very similar with gender. A lot of times we don't even appreciate that women weren't offered any agency beyond the threshold of their household until They were given the vote. We were given the vote in early 1900s and then allowed into the workplace during World War II. So we've just got a tremendous amount of work to do. And it's unfortunate a lot of organizations and corporations are like, well, is that my job? That should have been the job of the schools. But I'm like, well, they didn't do so great. If you're Generation X or baby boomer, chances are you didn't get that educational learning. Millennials are a little farther along, and as well as Gen Zs. So I'd say lack of understanding, unhealthy business culture. If you don't have a healthy business culture, your DEI work is dead in the water, because you have to be able to build trust. You have to have courageous conversations. There has to be integrity in what you say and what you do. If you've got a culture that elevates, competition over collaboration, if you, punish out of the box thinkers, you're not going to do a good job at inclusion. And then the last piece is organizations need to focus on middle management. I think that middle management is often where DEI strategies go to die. And it's not because the leaders don't care or because there's like groundswell from the folks at the bottom. It's because middle managers are not really incentivized to carry forward DEI strategies and initiatives. They don't necessarily have the resources and the muscle to be able to do it well, because you need training. And so that's what I would say. The need for increased racial literacy and learning, the need to really strengthen organizational culture in order to be able to hold the weight of this sort of work. And the last piece is just to focus on really supporting middle management in executing against these goals. So, over the course of your career working with major brands, what have you seen as some of the biggest challenges blocking progress on the DEI front?
But some of the things that you mentioned, around culture, and I believe a lot of that culture is set from the top. So what I've seen is some challenges is not getting that formal validation from executive leadership team, because in a sense, when you have that support from executive leadership at your particular company, it's almost signaling public support. And when you don't have that, it can feel kind of out of sight, out of mind. Also, not taking the time to connect and really kind of understand your diverse employee base to make sure that, everything is kind of supporting the needs of your bigger population, of employees. This one it's very interesting, which is around budget.
Yeah.
Very quick to cut budgets supporting multicultural or DEI initiatives.
Yep.
I have experienced this a lot at various companies where I've worked on multicultural initiatives. And when it's that time for budget cut season, the first things that get cut are multicultural programs or supporting D&I. And then there's the assumption that those general marketing programs or efforts that are being developed will reach the multicultural consumer. And I find that just to be it's crazy. And I saw this fact that companies with inclusive cultures, they saw it's a 2.3 times higher cash flow per employee over a 3-year period.
Wow.
So really valuing diversity helps to drive business performance. Also not hiring DEI experts at the executive level to develop programs. I think sometimes companies will lean on middle management or ERGs, but really to drive systemic kind of change and looking at things from a top-down perspective, you need to have that expert at the executive level. And then finally, I think companies have to do a better job of realizing how important ERGs are, but also, and ERGs is employee relations group, that it's a heavy obligation for the employees that are working in these areas. And it competes with the demands of the job. And so I've been in situations where I've had leaders that were not supportive of my efforts. And that was very disheartening because I felt like I was giving my time and being a conscious leader to really make a difference, where I work. So those are just some of the things I think about over my time and career of things where companies have kind of gone wrong. And so, as we kind of start kind of digging more into this DEI journey, I was just wondering, what do you recommend for mid-market executives who are just trying to get started in their DEI journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say it's so important to educate yourself. And I know I keep coming back to this understanding and knowledge piece, but really it's important to do your own deep dive across the areas of difference, because I feel that our society has not really prioritized curiosity about the other. And so it's important to educate yourself, but also not to get stuck in paralysis of analysis, which is where I see a lot of companies get stuck, where they're on this learning track for years and years. And I'm like, are you gonna do something? It's great that you're learning. It's great that you're trying to socialize this within your organization, among your people. Understand that in organizations, folks can come to this conversation in different places. But when are you gonna do something? Because that's what we need when we talk about anti-racist organizations. It's about applying the effort to bring about a world where race does not have as much of a determining power in the outcomes that we see. And so educate yourself, but don't get stuck. Appreciate that this conversation is not going away. I think a lot of folks are like, oh God, I'm so tired of talking about it. And it's like, well, your fatigue does not make it any less real and relevant and salient to this moment. What we know is that, we talk about this nation being majority minority by 2045, but I really appreciate a different framing that I heard someone reference, is that we're all going to be minorities in 15, 20 years. And so no longer will we have a nation where greater than 50% of the population is white. And so we really need to start thinking about, how do we build a muscle to apply sustained effort and resource to this conversation around DEI, because it's not going away. And if you're an organization or a company and you're hoping and praying and crossing your fingers, and you're, getting more and more comfortable with being around people who look like you, who think like you, who talk like you, then there's your competitor who's across the way, and they're bringing in folks who think differently, who look differently, who act differently, who behave differently, but who have the capabilities to, develop the products and the services of the future. And they're going to eat your lunch. And that's just the reality of it, because this is an emerging, interconnected world, and it's going to look for folks who can kind of hover on that cutting edge. So appreciate that DEI is not going away. Educate yourself and start small and be consistent. It doesn't have to be super ambitious. You have to just stay at it. And often it comes down to, going back to this culture conversation, helping your team to develop the soft skills to be in spaces with people who are different. Right. I think often for a long time, corporate America and business, it's been about assimilation, like assimilating into the current kind of way of doing things. And that model is dead. It's not about assimilation, it's about integration and inclusion. And so that's going to require a shift and a development of new skills and new skill sets. And so the more you can help your folks like build their own emotional intelligence, focus on mindfulness, being self-aware, lean into those soft skills, because it's really going to help you when it comes to activating on specific DEI initiatives. So how about large corporations or brands? What have you seen them get right?
Well, as I mentioned before, I believe everything has to start at the top. Yeah. And so it's critical to have the involvement of the executive leadership team. And I even think that you have to go a step deeper to make sure that D&I goals are incorporated into their performance. Yeah. Because that's another way to kind of reassure that it will remain a focus of top leadership. Also leveraging data, workforce data, particularly to kind of understand the trends at the company and trends with consumers. It's interesting. In one of my past experiences, our executive leadership team looked at workforce data and uncovered a trend that women of color were leaving the company at a faster rate. And this particular executive who identified this data actually created a task force that focused on this issue. It was mentioned at every town hall meeting that we had. And there was active engagement from that executive leadership team. I've never seen anything like that before in my life. But I felt like having that reassurance and support was motivating for me, being an employee at the company and realizing that the company was trying to make a difference to retain people who look like me. The other part is looking at the power of D&I and that work and how it can drive, business performance. Some of the facts that I mentioned earlier, but I've also been involved in situations where employee relations groups, they are involved in new program ideation and innovation, which helps drive profit for the company. And I love to see companies leverage the expertise of their particular, employee relations group to make great products for the diverse consumers that they service.
Mm-hmm.
Other part that I mentioned too is really around thinking about the 3 R's, which is representation, relevance, and resonance. And this is something that I've seen, quite a few companies do well with this. So when you're thinking about representation, making sure that you have the right type of casting if you're developing creative. And I think we've seen a lot of this over the past summer, where there was a lot of news about the movie In the Heights, about maybe not having the right type of casting to reflect the diversity of Latinos. But then you look at the difference of Encanto, which is really resonating with everybody. And I felt like it showed diversity greatly across the community. Yes, I love that movie.
I loved it. I loved it. And I loved all those hues. And I'm not even gonna lie, I was watching In the Heights. I grew up in Camden, New Jersey. And so I grew up around, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans. And so when I was watching that movie, I said, something not right here. And to be honest with you, I couldn't even get through it because I was so frustrated. So yes, I'm sorry. You were saying.
Oh, no. Relevance. And I mean, you were talking about that, in a sense, looking at your own experience. So the work that's being done, that it's relevant to the target that you're trying to go after. And again, I've been in situations where people are like, hey, we want to take this general market material and we're just going to give it, cast it and focus it towards multicultural consumers. And then the resonance piece. So it's really about making sure, as you started thinking about your targeting and your efforts, you're programming it and putting it in the right places where those consumers can see it.
Yeah.
The other piece that I mentioned that I think about is around support, making sure that there's funding to support these groups and initiatives. I see the work that's done on a D&I perspective at an employee relations group. It's been a great way to drive recruitment at the company, support retention efforts. And I know especially a lot of the work that I did in 2020, especially when we were going through so much racial unrest, it was a place for us to kind of come and kind of just lay your head down and feel comfortable. Yeah. And a place where people could understand, okay, we know how you feel, lean your shoulder, and just inspire. And so that was something that I was very proud of supporting during that time. And then also making sure that we're rewarding the people who are taking their time to work on these initiatives. Because again, a lot of time and effort is put into this. And there are many times you're not rewarded from a financial perspective. My reward came from just seeing the joy in the people that I supported, if I inspired someone. But it would be great to kind of get that reinforcement from corporations to also maybe provide a bonus or, budget, support the effort. So those are just some of the things I see companies getting right. But, Kelly, how about you? What have you seen as common pitfalls with this work?
I would echo much of what you said. Don't expect marginalized groups to carry the burden. We didn't create this system. Why do we have to be responsible for fixing it? Oftentimes, the ones who have the most power are not in the room. And so it's important for us to share the burden of righting society, because it shouldn't fall to marginalized groups to fix a system that adversely impacts them, right? So yes, that's key. And appreciate that this is an emerging professionalized area of expertise. It's very frustrating to me when I see corporations just lean on the woman, or lean on the senior level woman, or lean on the senior level a woman of color or person of color. And it's like, number one, how do you even know that they have the skills and the capabilities to do this well? because you can hold certain ideas that are adverse to a group and still be part of that group. But also, if you were to hire a branding consultant or a marketing consultant, you would pay them and compensate them, right? So appreciate that this is a professionalized area. I'll allocate budget to it. Sometimes when I see the budgets within these organizations, I think to myself, you spend more money on toilet paper than you spend on DEI. You should be embarrassed. So we put our money where on things that we value. If you value DEI, then apply the resources that are necessary in order for it to be successful. So those are my thoughts. But I'm on the outside. You're on the inside fighting these battles within corporations. And I would imagine that gets pretty fatiguing. I'm curious how you stay encouraged.
Yes, it's a great question, because at times it has been a lot, and especially over the past couple of years of everything that we've experienced, trying to keep the light bright for your team.
Yeah.
You're living and experiencing all the things that we have experienced over the past couple of years. It's a challenge. But I kind of think of a couple of things, which is there is this phrase that says, if I don't do anything, I will not be heard. And I know that my voice is a representation of many different people. And I know that if I don't do anything, then it's, you can assume that no one else will hear anything.
Mm-hmm.
I also think about the sacrifice of my ancestors and what they had to go through to get us to this point. And I feel like it's my duty to make sure that I continue the fight to move forward and make change. We also have to have this, I have to have patience in the sense to know that this is a marathon and not a race, that this is something, we'll continue to see change over time, and it can be slow. But the key is to make sure that you keep momentum and keep looking forward. And then, celebrate the small wins. I think about some of the work that I've worked at previous companies and being able to get more focus on things that are important for diversity and inclusion. Make sure you take the time to celebrate those wins when they happen. So.
Yeah.
And so for you, if there was one thing that had the greatest power to move a needle on this body of work for D&I, what would it be?
And I know we're coming up on time. I wanted to leave time for Q&A, so I'll be quick. Like, help people develop soft skills. And I mentioned it already. Help them to, develop the skills that enable them to be in spaces with people who are different. I hear folks tell me a lot of times, you're such an authentic leader. You're such an authentic leader because, I'm direct and I'm straightforward and I tend to be kind of animated. And I'm like, all of my Black girlfriends are this way. They just can't go into their corporate job and kind of live out loud in the ways that I can. And so many people feel that they have to dim themselves in order to, be successful within corporate spaces. And so we really need to work on that. You shouldn't have to have multiple identities in order to survive and thrive within these business spaces. So that would be my advice. What would be one piece of advice that you would have for those who are really wanting to get unstuck?
So I would say probably two, but they're kind of are connected, which is I love Oprah and I love Maya Angelou. And so really the first part of it is a decision process to want to do something. And Oprah states that nothing happens unless you decide. Mm-hmm. But it's not enough to just make the decision to want to do something. Then it's more about the work. And Maya Angelou states that nothing will work unless you do. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the advice that I would give to people who are stuck. So.
I love it. I love it. So I guess, do we kick it to Anna for questions?
We've got some questions rolling in. Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion. Leshawnda, I liked your phrasing of keep the light bright for the team. I think that's something that we're all trying to do. So Lauren Cunningham asks, how do you go about opening the conversation within a company in a group setting to discuss DEI and walk the walk once the talk has been talked?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say, unfortunately, because of circumstances that happened, it allowed the opportunity. I wish it would have happened a different way, but in 2020, when all of the racial unrest activities started to happen, we created this a forum, an employee forum, for employees just to come and talk about how they feel. And to this day, I have never experienced in anything like this, where employees, all levels, even executives, talked about their experience of being diverse in this country and how that particular those situations really impact people. But then it was great to have such diversity there and such great support for individuals. And I remember when we did the call, it was a Zoom, we were actually over capacity. And actually people were listening via the phone. That's how many people were involved in the discussion. And so that actually led to, taking that opportunity to build relationships with the executive leadership team, which then led to the development of a D&I council. And so that was a way to kind of spark conversation and then keep momentum moving by having this council that's created, and then having an opportunity to have these touch points where we would look on a quarterly basis. Okay, this is our area of focus, what's happening, and then also having measurable data to kind of help understand what impact is being made.
I think that's great advice. The only thing that I would add to that is get professional help. If you're like convening this there will be people, I've been a consultant my entire career, and folks will reach out to me and say, we're trying to facilitate a conversation with our staff on issues of DEI. And I'm like, let me give you some references, because I don't have the skills for that, because these conversations can be fraught. And you really need to find a professional that's going to enable you to create safe, brave space, not just safe space, because it's not about being just safe and I don't want to have hard conversations. No, it's about saying we're going to have a hard conversation and we're going to get through this together, because it's an important conversation to have. So that would be my only offering, to find somebody that can really be a shaman and hold your hand as you kind of move through the process.
Thank you for that. So Janice Abraham, she says, I lead a mid-sized company of approximately 200 people. A recent staff survey came back with compliments on my commitment to DEI and raising questions that other C-suite leaders may not be as committed to DEI. Do you have suggestions on helping the other 6 members of the executive team share my passion and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, for me, I always go to the dollars. And so I think about it from a twofold. I think one of the quotes that I mentioned earlier was that companies that had inclusive cultures, it saw a 2.3 times higher cash flow per employee over a 3-year period. So, the companies were thriving from a financial perspective. But then I also think about from a consumer perspective. And you see the growth of the target of multicultural consumers, and so you want to make sure that the services that you're doing and creating, the involvement that you have in the community, that it's resonating, because if you're selling something, it helps to create a pull in the marketplace. And so that's how I kind of look at it, from a twofold perspective of you get better performance from your employees, but then also it helps create a push in as you're selling something, from a customer basis.
I came across a statistic a couple of months ago, and it said that 1 in 7 children are born multiracial. And it's contributing to the decline in the white population, because as white folks pass, they're being replaced by their multiracial grandchildren who identify as people of color. And the reason I brought that up is because there is a whole generation of white grandparents with multiracial grandchildren that all of a sudden have become activated, right? Because they see the challenges related to race in the faces of their beautiful little brown grandbabies. Part of getting people to care about a thing is getting them proximate to the thing and getting them proximate to the issues and challenges. So I would say find opportunities to introduce these executives to the stories, to the narratives, to the experiences of women, disabled folks, people of color within your company. Because it's one thing to share the numbers, but some people process in their head and other folks process via their heart. And so I would say, try to find ways to hit them in the heart with the issues in the organization that you care about.
That's wonderful advice, and I hope that can help our question asker. To kind of get back to kind of Kelly, you kind of emphasizing that this is a professionalized area. You need professionals to do it. Will Cooper's asking, are there any innovative ways to allocate budget to DEI initiatives outside of education, training, research, and recruitment?
That's a good question. I'm going to punt that to Leshawnda because she said, oh, really? What are your thoughts? Where do you see this show up? Where have you seen it creatively show up in corporate line items, business organization line items?
Oh, wow. That's a very good question. I mean, I really just seen it in those areas that has been stated. I haven't really seen it in a different way. But again, I'm looking at it from a perspective of progression. And so, you know, we've been in corporate for a very long time. And so, you know, I come from a place where, you know, there wasn't any ERGs or, you know, support to companies where it's fully immersed. So that's a very good question, but I can't think of anything outside of the areas that the person mentioned.
Mm-hmm. I would say, and I wasn't able to write down the areas, but I would argue as many opportunities as you can give folks to be together and talk about things other than work. So retreats, you know, lunch and learns, even though you said learning, that is learning, but anything that you can do that gets folks to connect on a human level, I think is going to reap major benefits for whatever DEI efforts that you're pushing through your organization, because you ultimately want to get people to care about one another. If I care about you, then I care about your struggles. And I'm not necessarily going to lean into my assumptions around what your life is like, because I trust you and I trust whatever you tell me that this current state of affairs in your life. So I'd say find opportunities to get folks to connect on a personal level.
I do have one maybe thing to add that I have seen is community investment. Because I think the areas that were mentioned was education, training, research, and recruitment. And so I have seen companies also invest in their local communities. So making sure that they're focused, funneling support in the local communities where they are to help drive DEI initiatives, whether it's going to a community center or it's going to schools in the area to talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion, or teaching the students something new or different. So that is something I can think of. Yeah.
I love that, Leshawnda. I think that's spot on.
Leshawnda, you've mentioned ERGs a number of times. We have a question from Ashley. What would your advice be to maximize the effectiveness of ERGs in a company from various levels of management so that DEI is better realized within the company versus being a checklist item?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. What would your advice be to maximize the effectiveness of ERGs in a company from various levels of management so that DEI is better realized within the company versus being a checklist item?
So, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that I'll always talk about with the ERGs that I'm involved in is I'll always try to drive to what are things that we can do to help drive business impact. I think there's an impact that we can control internally from an employee, whether it's a retention perspective, you know, a recruitment perspective, but I also think about what are things that we can do to really make a difference with the business. And I've seen different initiatives of ERGs helping to be involved in innovation, developing new flavors for products that end up, you know, selling millions of dollars. Being involved in efforts to target different groups, if you're thinking about bullying, things of that nature. And so that's something that I really kind of think about. I would recommend for people who are thinking about ERGs because if you're making a business impact, then the company can ignore you, because then you're helping to drive, revenue for them.
That's great. And I think we have time for one more question. We have one from Valerie Hope, whose organization is committed to their goals of diversity. They've worked on a plan for their organization, but their surrounding communities don't have as many people of color to support that plan. What ideas do you have to support that?
One thing that I would suggest is, I know that we think about D&I from a people of color perspective, which it is, but I think what's also important is the development of allies. And so I think that they can also think of developing efforts from that perspective, because it's also important to have allies, people who can help support and drive D&I initiatives. So that's just one suggestion.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing that I would offer up is, and I've seen this with multinational corporations where diversity looks different in Nairobi than it does in Ireland, than it does in US versus if you, I don't know, look to somewhere in South America. So I think you have to figure out, like, what does inclusion look like for your organization based on your current context, and just be thoughtful about it. It might not really be a race play. It might be a gender play. It might be an able-bodied versus a disabled person play. It might be about making sure that you are creating real like ladders of opportunity for entry-level employees and ensuring that they're not left out or marginalized. So I think it just kind of requires some thinking. It doesn't necessarily all have to look the same, as long as it's responsive to the needs of your community and your organization.
And I think that's a wonderful place to end our discussion. Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for kind of contributing to our conscious community. We are very grateful. And thank you to everyone who joined us today as an attendee. We're dropping a survey into the chat. If you could just take a couple seconds to fill that out, it helps us with our future programming. If you're new to Conscious Capitalism, please visit our website, consciouscapitalism.org, to learn more. And if you're an executive currently implementing conscious practices in your business, we invite you to explore our growing support system of like-valued leaders in our Senior Leader Network. We'll drop the link for that as well. And I hope you'll join us next week on February 2nd, when we have Paul Rice, the founder and CEO of Fairtrade USA, who will share his insights into creating systemic change and innovative models. So we'll drop the link in there again. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.